presented by Jonathan Rushton, and he will hopefully give a very short introduction about himself. But I think the most important thing is that I think Jonathan is one of the founders of this program, and is invested in, currently there's a lot of research on GBETs going on, and it's included in many projects. So I think this is a very interesting program for us to hear about, and also to see how we can implement it in future projects and programs.
First of all, thank you, Inge, for the invitation to give this presentation. I'm aware that some people on the call know me, some people don't. I'm Jonathan Rushton, based at the University of Liverpool, where I'm Professor of Animal Health and Food Systems Economics. And I'm also the Director of the Global Burden of Animal Disease Programme, which is actually a co-led programme with the World Organization for Animal Health and the University of Liverpool, with a number of partners, including some people on this call. So we are linked to the DECIDE project that's led by Herdine Van Schaik, who's on the call at the moment, and also with the World Organization for Animal Health Collaborating Centre in Europe. And I think Miriam is on the call also. So I want to start with a kind of a few questions. I realize this is a kind of update the progress, but where I come from, of having worked for 30 years in the kind of livestock development, animal health space, there are things that always bother me about not being able to quite get the right answers. So a starting point for me is, what is the biomass of the animals we're actually keeping, and what economic investment do we have in these animals? Obviously, the animals produce something for us, but they're actually a major store of capital. And when we start looking at specific sectors within those livestock populations, can we actually identify production loss for a specific sector, or can we actually divide out a little bit more carefully the veterinary products that these animals are being applied with? And the final thing, which I think is a real gap in terms of animal health in general, is what's the biggest impact of the diseases on production, and how does that then translate into kind of wider economy and food supply? Now, those questions are kind of quite daunting. And when we start to place it into the context of specific people, and this is somebody I've worked with in Bolivia in the high Andes, this woman is struggling to make a living off a small number of animals. Might not be typical in a European context, but it's typical across the world. And wherever you look, you'll find people who are actually living with their animals and trying to derive a living from those animals, or using those animals in terms of service provision. And these people tend to be on the margin. They tend to be on the margins of society, and they're actually very important across the world. So one of the things I'd say quite clearly to everybody on the call interested in animal health is that we currently have hundreds of millions of poor producers who actually lack access to very basic animal health services and technologies. And that's a real challenge for us as we move forward. And they link into some pretty complex value chains, systems that are actually moving animals towards slaughter points or market points, a whole range of processing industries actually attached to those things, and impacts across that in terms of human health with regards to nutrition, antimicrobial resistance, or possibly foodborne and zoonotic disease issues. So alongside that big number of livestock producers and livestock holders, we have billions of people who are actually impacted on a day-to-day basis with regards to nutrition. And one of the big aspects with regards to that livestock sector is that many of those people are actually micronutrient protein deficient in their diets. And of course, we're currently challenged by very regular outbreaks of quite serious diseases. So we've had the avian influenza process ongoing really since the 1990s, and it seems to have stuck and got worse rather than better. We have the emergence of diseases that cause real challenges in the human health sector, and those things tend to be linked with how we keep animals and how we actually react towards those animals. What's driving that process? Well, the underlying driving process within this is actually our increase of our own population, the human population, but alongside that, actually a large number of animals that we keep to actually support our lifestyles and our nutrition needs. And then the final thing, as we increase our own number of people and the animals that we keep, we're having a greater and greater impact in terms of what that means with regards to the environment in which we live. And it's very important that we consider within the animal health space how we're managing the environment and the natural ecosystems. So in summary to that kind of background, we've got livestock and aquatic species that are important across human societies across the world. It's not just in Europe. Their health is really important and their welfare is important. And with that sort of background, we've started the Global Burden of Animal Disease program with 3 quite specific aims in mind as we move forward. So for our livestock keepers, our consumers, and the environment in general, we are very interested in making sure we've got investment plans that actually allow us to have adequate animal health systems. If we have a budget, that we actually know where to allocate resources that actually have the greatest impact in terms of the health and well-being, not just of the animals themselves, but also the livestock keepers. And we start to generate longitudinal data sets that actually capture some of these impacts and allow us to evaluate quite clearly the animal health investments that have gone on in the past. I think that can still be done even in a sort of historical sense, but currently we do not have those data sets. So there is an absence of that particular piece of work. So as most people would suggest, this is actually quite a large scale process. If you talk to people about it, it feels like an elephant, and which part of the elephant do you actually start to deal with? Well, we've started off with I think a fairly simplistic sort of analytical structure. We look at the livestock populations, we try and find data around those things. We're starting to estimate their biomass, which is obviously a critical component in thinking about both disease issues, but also other issues around climate change. We want to calculate the value of those animals and their output. And with that kind of background, we can start to think more carefully about a gap analysis, estimating what's currently being lost in terms of production, and also what's being spent in terms of our animal health interventions. We're calling that gap the animal health loss envelope. That provides a boundary in which we start to then think more carefully about the attribution by different diseases, health problems, and potentially accidents. Ideally, we'd actually sort of set this in terms of thinking more carefully about the absolute burden of each disease, but it could be a cluster of diseases, and also the relative burden compared to the rest of the animal health loss envelope in that particular structure. Now, this kind of farm level analysis will actually work towards thinking more carefully about the wider impact across the economy to actually understand who's actually affected by those disease problems. So I want to run through a series of slides about where we've got to with regards unpacking this quite simple analytical structure and some of the things we're working on, partly with colleagues actually on this call, but also across different groupings within the consortium that is the Global Burden of Animal Disease Programme. So I suppose in terms of unpacking this, the first step is obviously to separate by species. That's a pretty obvious statement. Rather more tricky one, and something that Jonas, who's on the call, has been working on very carefully in Ireland, is actually unpacking how, for example, cattle can be divided up into different production systems before we then do that gap analysis to calculate the animal health loss envelope, separating that out into different clusters of different types of diseases and possibly by individual disease causes, before we then sort of think more carefully about the economy and what trade impacts. Now, obviously, every stage that I'm describing here requires quite a lot of data, quite a lot of detailed data, and it also requires quite a range of different analytical procedures, from production system analysis to epidemiology, and then on into the wider economy issues to actually generate the kind of information which, if we have this available on a regular basis, is actually something that could have utility in terms of planning and actually thinking more carefully about where do we intervene in this system to actually reduce the negative impacts and optimize the positive impacts in this system. The first thing I just want to highlight, and we're still discussing exactly how we deal with this, because we have a range of countries across the world, some with data-rich sources like the Republic of Ireland, where Jonas has done tremendous work in terms of separating out cattle production systems. to populations that have very little data, where probably all we can achieve is actually just a separation between species. So we have to have a system at the global level that actually recognizes that variety of data richness. And potentially in some situations, all we can say is actually we can separate out by species. And even within species, there may be problems where maybe sheep and goats are actually mixed in that particular structure. So we're sort of discussing how we do this. Now, our classification system needs to respect that we have data that's being collected in terms of animal and commodity prices, input and output relationships, and also diseases, health problems, injuries and accidents. If we don't recognize the current data collection systems and try to impose a classification system that doesn't recognize those things, then we can't do the attribution or even the animal health loss envelope step particularly well. So what are we doing in that space in terms of, sort of moving that forward with regards to livestock data? Well, we're starting with, obviously the obvious thing is to start with FAO stat data. That's publicly available, it's easily accessible. We're starting to sort of think more carefully about how we draw that together. But we're also in discussion with private sector companies who hold better data than that and actually can provide finer implementation of different things. And we want to move from a situation where we've got a very sort of bland looking situation of maybe in this case, a map of Norway, which just indicates roughly where Norway is and roughly its sort of shape, to something that might be a higher resolution type approach, where we can actually see more carefully what the shape of that is and what we need to actually do. And the question is for the Global Burden of Animal Disease Program is, what level of detail do we require at different stages? For the global scale, it's probably more the standard map. For the situation in a country itself, for example, Norway, thinking more carefully about how they manage salmon disease issues, it probably requires more higher resolution issues. Therefore, the gradation of information we require will get greater as we get close to the actual farms that we're actually working with. And how do we support that? Well, we need some kind of model conceptualization, and we need to have a process based towards what kind of model outputs we're looking for. The model conceptualization helps us to identify data needs. It also helps us identify which parameters we've got to analyze. And if we've got data gaps, then we can use different approaches in terms of filling those data gaps with regards to statistical models, mathematical models, or simulation models that can then be calibrated against data that we actually find in the field itself. So that process is kind of ongoing in the program. We're also including within this approach where we have serious data gaps. We're actually starting to talk to experts, doing expert elicitation to actually fill problematic areas. We recognize that that's not ideal in all situations, but in some places where we're working, we're having to sort of resort to that kind of expert elicitation alongside the data that we can find. So what kinds of things are we generating at this moment? We've initially started doing dashboards around very simple things like the population estimates. These are population data from the FAO stat that we've pulled off. And we're searching for ways to actually link that with APIs, where we can see quite clearly kind of changes of population over time. Putting population numbers in that sense isn't very sensible. So we're comparing here poultry versus cattle. And that's obviously not very obvious. If we change that into a biomass calculation, we can see that in this particular case for Australia, we've had quite significant shifts of biomass across different species groupings, and therefore probably quite different significance levels when we start thinking about burden estimations. Moving on from that classification to the biomass and population issues, we are interested in actually having some kind of denominator around the total economic value of those animals that we keep. Peggy Stroback in CSIRO in Australia has developed this total economic value model where we've got things that cover non-use elements and also use elements. Now we recognize that many parts of this are actually quite difficult to actually achieve. So at the moment, we're focusing very hard on the things that where we've got quantitative data. This is actually the value of the animals and their primary outputs. And Peggy's turned that into a fairly simple, straightforward calculation with regards the summing of the value of the animals themselves as an asset and also the summing of the output of that particular structure. She's worked on this over data from the last 15 years, or sorry, 25 years in essence. And her initial estimations here are, I think, quite dramatic in terms of actually what this means. Now, don't take these numbers as read. We're still sort of working in terms of refining this, but we're looking at quite a high value of livestock in this particular system. So we've got a situation where probably the value of the animals themselves and the outputs on an annual basis are in the region of between 3.5 and $4 trillion a year. Now, that's roughly half of the value of the agricultural sector that's being generated. A large proportion of that value is actually in the animals, the capital asset themselves. And therefore, the responsibility to manage those animals becomes quite grave in terms of what do we do if we change things? How do people actually bank money if we actually remove the access to livestock? And what happens if we have a disease that actually destroys those animals? So we've gone from population onto biomass and then into the economic value of the animals. Then doing the gap analysis is actually the comparison between what we can achieve with current health status and what we could achieve with the ideal health status. The difference between these 2 points, as I said, we're calling the animal health loss envelope, and it's capturing what's something that John McInerney talked about back in the 1980s, this kind of production loss and expenditure frontier. So obviously every time we spend some money on animal health interventions, then our intention is to actually modify how much we're losing with regards to loss of animals through mortality or some kind of morbidity issue in terms of offtake, before we then move on to attribution. That sounds all very straightforward, but we obviously have to think very carefully about how do we set the ideal health in those livestock systems. In human health, with the Global Burden of Disease study that's led by the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation in Seattle, they've set their burden issues around a long life and a healthy life. With livestock, that's slightly different. With livestock, we're obviously keeping these animals for an economic purpose, and they're there to actually convert a set of inputs into a desirable set of outputs. They're adding value to the inputs that are going into that system. Now, the way this input-output relationship is set is very variable across different global livestock systems. And we need to think very carefully about how health actually affects the efficiency within that transformative process. Now, this is a challenge. We can sort of simplify it down in many systems where we could perhaps argue that in an ideal system for, say, dairy health, the animal will always have a first calving after 2 years, it will have a calf every year, and it might be replaced after 4 lactations. One of the difficulties within that dairy system is actually, well, what is the likely lactation of an ideal health cow in any situation? And we are doing some analysis around those sort of lactation curve issues, the growth rate curve in a fattening system, and also the egg laying curve issues in an egg laying system. So setting these ideal standards in these types of systems is not as straightforward as it seems at the outset. But essentially what we're working towards is a performance under ideal health minus the current performance to actually get that animal health loss envelope, to actually reveal a little bit more carefully that relationship between expenditure and production loss, which is actually the economic measure of our animal health system in general. Now, the background to this, and this is something that my team in Liverpool have been working very hard on, is how do we get to that? Well, we obviously need some kind of representation of the population in terms of splitting up into juvenile population, finished population, regarding sort of growth rates under ideal and current levels of production with fertility rates, with various sort of outputs that actually can then be calculated and estimated to actually get to the animal health loss envelope. So we're interested in the things that come off in terms of mortality, possibly things that come off the system in terms of unplanned offtake. So it could be animals that are actually condemned in the slaughterhouse, or animals that have to be culled too early, and then other products such as milk, eggs, or meat in that structure. Putting that into practice, we've been doing this with a company called First Analytics in the US to actually think more carefully about the idealized production versus the realized production, and splitting up the gap into slightly different things. So this will be the loss of production in the animal health loss envelope, the condemnations, the mortality, and the reduced growth, with some element which could just be around suboptimal feed and other practices in that particular structure. To actually get to this kind of information, we obviously need a whole range of data. So this is for the broiler sector, where we're thinking quite carefully about country level estimations and also things around placement of birds in particular structures, their carcass weight issues, and also information in the slaughterhouse with regards to condemnations. So with a very sort of crude split, this is for the UK in 2011, we're looking at an idealized production system where we've got roughly 1.5 or 1.4 million tons of meat being produced potentially, but actually in actual fact, we've got a realized production which is more like 1.3, with a burden of disease in the region of 90,000 tons of meat in that situation, and some kind of suboptimal feed practices, which is in the region of 28. Now, don't take this as read. This is not published at this stage. It's more as experimenting with how we actually utilize this system. We're also in the process of actually developing dashboards where we can represent this loss in production in terms of mortality and morbidity as an absolute, and also what the impact of that is in terms of an efficiency score with regards to burden of disease. So this basically just gives an absolute estimation of loss. And on the right-hand side, as you look, we've got an estimation of costs of production with the actual level of production, and a situation where if we removed all disease issues, we'd actually reduce the costs of production per kilo of meat, per kilo of live weight generated by about 19 cents of the dollar, which is about 20% efficiency loss in that particular structure. And we're interested in translating that kind of situation at a farm level into a broader structure. This is work done with Alexis de la Bourgeois for the French cattle system, thinking more carefully about bovine respiratory disease issues, where he broke up the population in that particular country with regards to females and males, thinking more carefully about breeding stock versus producing animals and fattening animals, and actually what is the impact across that in terms of efficiency change. So we've gone from population, biomass, economic value, and then that gap analysis to capture the animal health loss envelope. We then need to think quite carefully about how do we then attribute that in terms of different groupings of disease. Now, we're working closely with Megan Bruce and Andrew Larkins with regards how do we group things to begin with. And our first kind of classification point is thinking very carefully about communicable diseases, non-communicable diseases, and external forces. The reason we've done it in this particular way, this is following the mold really of the global burden of disease in humans, where they also separate broadly into these kind of categories. And it starts to sort of elucidate some of the important things that we tend to focus on. So we'll tend to focus mainly with the veterinary services in the public domain with communicable diseases that actually cause trade impacts. But we tend to not do a huge amount in the public sector with regards to the NCDs or the external forces in that particular situation. But actually having that information to hand should help governments make better judgments about where they should be placing their money, particularly when health is having an impact on the environment in general. And Megan and her team are taking this from a perspective where we could actually start to begin by thinking about a functional limitation in the system. So we could start by stating we've got reduced lambing percentage in a particular sheep system. These are data from Australia where we've got lamb mortality as high as 35%. What's causing that particular lambing percentage and that lambing mortality? Well, it's a range of different things. It could be fetal loss, abortion, stillbirth, lamb mortality itself. And the causes of that can be broken down into certain clusters of different things. It could be external forces. What do we mean by that? It could be starvation. It might be predation. There might be non-communicable diseases that are actually causing issues here, which might be around, again, nutrition issues or possibly pregnancy toxemia. And then a range of things that could either be exotic or endemic infectious disease issues. And we can apply that kind of into an outcome tree for a specific disease, where we start to think about the symptomatic infection, leading to various things that actually cause an impact and a loss in terms of production and with regards to expenditure. Now, I'm showing this as a schematic at the moment. Megan and her team have started to apply this process with data we're collecting in Ethiopia, using expert elicitation. And I hope in the time, in the next sort of 3 or 4 months, we can start to sort of release some of the data that she's working on to actually do this kind of work in a quantitative sense. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is actually think more carefully about the inputs into the livestock system and actually identifying the burden of disease across a more complicated structure. So everything I've talked about so far is very much at a farm level. It could be applied at a sort of population level, but we need to use that farm level change in terms of thinking very broadly about an economic assessment. So we want to avoid having a situation where we just talk about absolute burdens, but then not putting it back into a wider economy type model. We're working with economists in the US, Dustin Pendle and Tom Marsh, who've had lots of experience of applying wider economy models, where we can actually sort of look more carefully, what would happen if we actually remove that animal health loss envelope? What would that mean in terms of the overall equilibrium of our agricultural sector, in terms of inputs and outputs across the economy as a whole, but also the government expenditure with regards to budgeting, to get an overall assessment of the total economic impact of the diseases themselves. And in addition to that, we've also got a human health theme led by David Piggott and Breck, whose name I'm not going to try and pronounce, but Breck is involved in the FERG studies and David is involved in the GBD work. And they're using a model to think more carefully about the zoonotic impacts, the antimicrobial resistance, and nutrition issues. So what are we trying to generate here? And these again are illustrative figures at this stage. I'm keen that we actually have a representation for wherever you want to go, from a sort of global to a national level, where we can actually indicate what is the value of the animals that we're actually keeping, and how do we split that by species and potentially by production system. Of the animals we keep, what's the gap in terms of what we're losing in terms of animal health? And can we break that up in terms of, say, mortality, morbidity in its very crude sense, and also around expenditure? And can we attribute the animal health loss envelope in terms of, say, notifiable diseases, endemic diseases, injuries and accidents, with the need to actually recognize there's going to be a part of that animal health loss envelope that we can't actually explain, and that in itself could be quite an important research area. And then finally, with that kind of gap in production, who's actually impacted? Is it going to be the producers? Will it be the consumers? Will it be an impact across the value chain itself? Having this kind of information to hand is actually a very important part of actually thinking about policy. So should it be the government that's trying to change that pattern, or does it need to be pushed back into the private sector? And this starts to answer a range of questions in terms of what's our exposure to risk, not just in terms of the disease presence, but also who's bearing the costs of actually any kind of change. How large is the gap between actual production and that more ideal state of health? Which are the most problematic problems do we have? And are we actually balancing the expenditure loss and the loss in production with our problematic hazards? And I suppose the final question is just, again, coming back to that question I posed before, do we actually have our current public and private expenditure balance that actually reflects appropriately the societal needs we've got at this particular point in time? So to try and summarize this, and this is something that Gemma Chaters and Will Gilbert have been working on with me in the last week or so, we've got a range of data inputs going into supporting a production system classification. And for the different groups of animals, we're thinking very carefully about what are they producing in terms of outputs, what's their biomass, combining that to give us a total economic value for those particular animals and their production systems, generating that gap analysis with regards to the animal health loss envelope, then attributing that by different causes and ideally by risk factors. And that information can then be used in a wider economic impact work to actually think more carefully about who's impacted across society, and also recognizing that these impacts can also have quite serious implications with regards to zoonoses, antimicrobial resistance, and nutrition. So that's where we're at this stage with regards some of the details that we're working on with the technical side. I'm not covering everything that we're doing at the moment. If you've got specific questions or requirements or interests in anything I've talked about, I can direct you to the people that can talk more carefully about the things we're doing from a technical perspective. But I do want to sort of think more carefully about how we're rolling this out. One of the things we've been challenged with quite a lot by our funders, our main funder is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, is who's this for? So who actually needs this? And we see a range of different users of this kind of information. It could be governments, it could be the private sector, it may well be investors in terms of actually supporting that livestock sector. But what we want to do is make sure that we actually provide information that is actually useful in terms of people's needs to actually make better decisions with regards to animal health and animal health investments. And we're currently working to spread out what we're doing in different parts of the world. We've got an ongoing case study in Ethiopia, which is supported by our main funders at the moment, and we're working very carefully on cattle, small ruminants, poultry, equids, and also camels in that country, so covering all the species that are main species in Ethiopia. By the end of the year, I'm hoping that we'll have most of the data together as far as we can go with the data that's actually available. We're just about to initiate a case study in Indonesia, supported by the Australian government, and we're in discussions in different parts of the world in terms of initiating work, both in terrestrial animals, but also in aquatic species. A couple of people on this call are involved in our collaborating centre for the World Organization for Animal Health, and we're doing case study work in Norway, the Netherlands, and the UK with that work. And we're involved in the DECIDE project led by Herdine, which again is working in different parts of Europe with regards to endemic disease issues, but also involves some of the steps that I've just talked about with regards to technical issues. So big things at the moment, I suppose, are those country case studies. We're looking to expand that. We've had a meeting in the last week with Senegal to talk about how we do a case study in Senegal. We have that OIE Collaborating Centre on the Use of Economics of Animal Health that started in 2021. And we're looking to expand the partners in terms of actually how we move that forward. But we're also looking to establish similar centres in other World Organization for Animal Health regions, in the Americas, in Asia. One of the big things I'd say, I don't want our program to mirror necessarily how the human global burden of disease work has gone. I'm very interested in how we actually develop capacities of individuals and organizations in the use of methods, the interpretation of data, and also obviously the generation and management of funds to actually make sure we keep supporting the animal health sector appropriately. Now, I'm kind of glad we've had the opportunity to present to you and to your program or your project today. We can't do this alone. This is a piece of work which is actually about trying to bring together data, projects to actually encourage and develop a cadre of young people to sort of take this forward. So if there are things that you're interested in, please come to us, sort of explain to us your needs or your data sources, etc. And let's see how we can sort of join the pieces together to make sure we get the best outcomes from what we're trying to achieve. So I just want to kind of summarize about what we're about. The Global Burden of Animal Disease Programme is about estimating burdens of diseases and health problems in animals. That information, we believe, will actually support judgments and decisions on what diseases and health problems are actually priorities. It should provide information where we can actually improve how we project and make predictions of the future, and therefore actually provide a basis for better quality assessments of interventions. We're not currently talking about doing cost-benefit analysis or cost-effectiveness analysis of changes. We're simply providing information and data that actually would support those kinds of intervention assessments. And that information, we plan to actually support investment allocation and evaluation of animal health to actually reach sustainable development goals. And our comparator really is the human burden of disease. They have succeeded in developing a metric which has quite powerful meaning. So that disability adjusted life year can be explained quite quickly. It's something that people tend to understand. You can teach it quite easily with students. And yet the actual global estimations have lots and lots of complexity underneath that. This is a picture that's been shared with me by David Piggott at the University of Washington. And you can see that there's a whole range of data flows and analytics that take place to get back to that estimation of the DALY at a global level. But that metric's been very successful over the last 20 or 30 years in providing powerful meaning with regards to the burden of disease in humans, and also actually using it as a policy way of rationing resources across human health. We've tried to do this in a similar sense by providing a fairly straightforward analytical structure that I've just described to you today, where we're moving from livestock populations across to the impact across the economy, generating a range of information which we see that users might be able to actually apply in their different systems. And the flow of that analysis is basically around estimating the biomass of the animals, thinking about the economic value of those animals, doing that gap analysis, that animal health loss envelope, and calculating an efficiency change in that livestock systems, and using that in wider economy models with regards either partial equilibrium models or generalizable equilibrium models to actually estimate the burden across the society as a whole. What data do we require for this? We need population data. I know it's available in Eurostat. Some of it's good, some of it's not so good. We need to understand how good it is. Production performance, that data is best handled probably in private sector data sets. Getting access to those data is not straightforward. Animal health expenditure is collected, but it's not very well stored and it's not easily accessible. It's good for pet animals, it's no good for livestock animals. So we've got a bit of a challenge in that space. We need better information about the levels of disease, both incidence and prevalence. And something we are lacking in the literature is actually what is the real impact of any particular disease or health problem on mortality or on morbidity. Again, these sound really straightforward, but for some of our really big ticket diseases, we actually don't know what the impact is, and we're making guesses all the time. Transmission of diseases from livestock and aquatic animals into people obviously is quite an important thing, particularly important in antimicrobial resistance work, and we still haven't really nailed that down very well. And do we have diseases that are simply being managed by legislation, which is actually causing an impact in terms of what we do in terms of trade? We're working on a basis with the program to make sure we actually verify all the models we're actually dealing with, and also the data flows, and trying to document those things. We're supported by a group in Guelph University who are running our informatics, actually doing that particular process. We're trying to validate our models against real data. And we're trying to make sure, obviously, for this particular program, that everything we do is repeatable and consistent across levels of local, national, and global burden of disease issues. And we're generating dashboards. I've shown you one or two things we're doing at the moment. They're not really sort of publicly accessible at the moment, but we are intending to actually start to have dashboards where you can look at the global level of burden estimation, some sector level issues, say for fattening animals such as broilers, the dairy sector, with country level estimations where we can get hold of better data and better information. And the value that we believe we're adding to this, if we do a cross-sectional study of the burden of disease, we can start to think more carefully about misallocation of expenditure. Are we getting the balance between preventive and curative medicine right? I know the mantra is that prevention is better than cure, but that's not always applied in general senses. So we have to understand whether we're getting that balance right. Do we have inefficient use of animal health technologies at farm level? And what's the efficiency, equity, and environmental impacts at the economy-wide level? The really big ticket item for me is that I see this not as a project, but as a program. So we need to move forward and keep generating these burden estimations. If we end up with a time series of burden changes, then we can start to understand a little bit better which policies work best with regards education, research, legislation, mitigation interventions, and technology changes. So we want to generate that time series data on burden to actually allow us to sort of examine this a bit more carefully. So in summary, we're bringing together data, analytics, and resources to develop a knowledge engine that actually allow us to think more carefully about the burden of animal diseases in terms of economic efficiency, social equity, including gender, and also the impacts on the environment. So we can actually make better judgments with regards how we invest money in animal health, how we allocate that money in terms of priority issues, and also how we evaluate those particular interventions to make sure we're getting the best outcomes. Now, if you want a little bit more information, it's not particularly technical, but we've generated an OIE panorama on the global burden of animal disease, which are, I think, about 25 short articles of about 300 words. We've got a few publications that we put out recently. One last year covers a kind of overview of what I've just talked about. And we have a digital narrative, which you can see on that particular site. I just want to recognize that the work I've described is supported by a range of different funders, including the European Commission. Our main funder is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the UK government. And this is a program led by the World Organization for Animal Health and the University of Liverpool, with a range of partners and collaborators, including people on this call today. So that's part of our team. That's just a picture of the team together. So thanks for your time. If there are any questions, I'm ready to take them. Thank you.